All right. Hey, Paul. How are you?
Hey, I'm really well.
Thank you for coming on the
Thanks.
show. I
Yeah,
appreciate
well,
it.
thanks for having me. Thanks for your interest in the book.
So, your book is called Memoir Raising a Thief. It sounds like a pretty interesting, poignant kind of story, yeah?
It's a story about being a parent to a challenging kid. And a lot of parents have had that experience in different forms. And this story is about my wife and I, our experience wrestling with that challenge.
Okay, now was this an adopted child or a natural child, biological child?
It's adopted child. We have two children, and the first one, our older one, is biological child, and we wanted to grow our family, and we also really wanted to adopt, and we adopted a younger one, Sonia, who was treated just terribly before we took her into our home. And while the terrible treatment only happened in her first 16 months of life, and we were of the belief when we adopted her that a loving home could cure all of that, it turned out that the consequences of that terrible 16 months lasted much longer and were much deeper than we'd ever anticipated.
She was only 16 months when you adopted her?
Yeah, this is what's so surprising. Our daughter was starved before we took her in and almost died, and then was
Oh,
hospitalized. And she was adopted from Russia. And in Russia, the orphans often do not get held when they're in a hospital. And then she was in an orphanage. So by the time we adopted her, we were her fourth home. And because we'd been relatively okay parents, as far as we could tell, with child number one, we thought, well, we can handle this. And what we found out, and what the story is about, is that actually the earlier damage happens to a child, the more profound and long lasting the damage could be. While the kids don't remember, obviously, what happened, there's a concept in psychology called attachment, which is really the foundation of much to human functioning. And that occurs really in those first years, first couple of months, first 16 months, first 24 months of a child's life. And that was interrupted with our daughter.
okay. So she was in an orphanage in Russia, or
Yep,
many orphanages, or
just one. So she
just
was with the
one?
birth mom for 6 months where she was starved, the terrible treatment. She was screaming so loudly, the neighbors called the police. Then the birth mother was stripped of her rights of maternity by the Russian state. Now, I started my career in Russia. I'm American. I met my wife there. Russia's a tough place. So for them to say that parenting is too tough and too brutal is really an extreme case of mistreatment. Then she was in the hospital. Then we adopted her. And what we found early on is that she really had a different set of reactions to things around her than not only our biological son, but all the other children we knew. She quite early on was extremely controlling and unpredictable with what she ate. She ran away. The minute she could begin to verbalize, she began to lie. And then when she got slightly older, she began to steal. And while all children do these behaviors to some degree, the intensity and the relentlessness and the ability to function any other way really formed a diagnosis that is different about kids like this. She has something called attachment disorder. Unless you think that this is something that is just unusual with adopted kids, first of all, not all adopted kids have it. If they're treated well, they won't get that. Second of all, it's quite widespread globally and in the United States. So think about children whose parents are on military deployment, or children who suddenly lose a caretaker due to COVID. Any interruption in that very early childhood bond with their primary caregiver can have huge long term consequences on a child's ability to function in a social situation in a healthy way.
In your case, it was in a very extreme case. But certainly, a lot of us have grown up with parents who might have been, for lack of a better word, indifferent.
Yeah.
Maybe not the most loving. I mean, you have this sort of parents who are overprotective of their children, and then you have some parents who are kind of underprotective of their children. And there is a
Yes.
fine line there. There is a balance. In her case, it sounds like it was an extreme situation in Russia, though. But it didn't, but your influence and your wife's in bringing her to America didn't change it, right? It didn't fix the damage that had already been done, it sounds like.
No, it didn't. And there are many, many families like this in the United States, and I know it because writing the book, they've reached out to me, and then on various different social media groups, you can contact them, et cetera. So there's a lot of people struggling with it. But Doug, your question is spot on, which is that how come some kids endure really difficult things in childhood and bounce back, and other kids don't? And this is a question I address in the book. In fact, if you look at the childhoods of myself or my wife, they also weren't perfect. My wife, as I mentioned, she was born in Russia. They lived abroad some. She was kidnapped as a child in Pakistan.
Oh,
Kidnapped. Okay. And my mother died of cancer when I was quite young, which is also not an optimal situation for a kid. But both my wife and I turned out fine. And a lot of people have difficulties. Everybody has difficulties they're wrestling with in their life, and people's childhoods aren't perfect. But the distinguishing factor between people who are seriously dysfunctional and people who aren't, and with our daughter, we tried lots of interventions, and I go into all of them in the book. The one predictive thing about the difference between those people who bounce back and those people who don't is A, the severity of what happened, and B, again, the timing of what happened. And that early period of time is so critical. So if you think about in terms of public policy, what types of things would make a huge difference in reducing the outcome of the situation that we had in our family, investment in early childhood education is transformative because it can, an early childhood care, because that first period of time is so critical. And what happened with our family is a case study of that, because once the damage was done, even having leading psychologists and psychiatrists and medication and different types of schooling, it didn't serve to alter the underlying perspective that our daughter carried, which was one full of rooted in distrust that the world is out to get her and trying to constantly manipulate and the environment around her so that she feels safe. So children like this have a very distorted sense of reality, and it's very difficult for them to shift that. And that's continued. She's an adult now, so the story takes place over 20 years. It's continued into adulthood.
I was going to ask you, you kind of touched on that point, but I was going to ask you about if at some point when her behavior and emotional state got out of control, if you guys went to any doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, anything like
Yeah.
that to try to
Yes.
get help for
Yes.
her?
It's absolutely. It started very early on when we began to see when she when she was in pre-K and she began to rob all of her classmates. And it's kind of funny looking back in retrospect, but at the time as a parent, you're like, oh my goodness, what is going on? She first started coming home, and I talk about this in the book, with all this stuff from school, and I was like, what is going on? And they were like, oh, my friends give it to me, and I was like, what kind of kids are giving away all of their stuff in pre-K? And then, sure enough, they found out that during nap time, she would wait till all the kids were taking their nap and the caretakers were out of the room. She would quietly get up and begin robbing everybody around her.
Oh my
And that
God.
continued. Yeah, stunning, right? And that continued as she got older, too. When she was in swim practice, she would say, oh, I need to use the restroom. The coach would say, okay. Who would think? She would go in there and just rip off the entire locker room. And that type of stealing, why are you doing that? Well, you're trying to strike back at the society around you, and it's kind of irrational. So very early on, we began to go to social workers, psychologists looking for help. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is that it took a long time to get the proper diagnosis. In our case, it took about 8 years. And just like it's very difficult to fix a broken arm if you think that you have a broken leg, getting a key diagnosis is critical to helping a child like this. And particularly in societies that are relatively stable, we were living in Brookline, Massachusetts at the time. very pleasant place.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we're dealing with a lot of children that had incredibly tumultuous backgrounds. However, incidents where there has been famine, where there has been war, where there's been massive economic disruption, or now a pandemic, you will see incidences of this begin to rise. And what we were dealing with, this attachment disorder, first was discovered and named in the UK in the 30s at a period of time of massive social upheaval when many, many kids were separated from their parents.
Right.
So stories of our daughter and of our family struggle and coming up with a diagnosis and trying to tell this in a way that makes it very readable. Many people say they finish the book in 24 hours. So once they open it up, they can't put down. But it also tells a little bit the story of psychology and of the psychiatrist who's really quite brilliant, who I'd never heard of before doing the research, who discovered this, a guy by the name of John Bowlby.
Okay. We're kind of running our time down, but I just wanted to hit on a couple of points. Let's fast forward. How is Sonia now? How old is she, first of all?
She's 20 years old. So there's some things are going well, some things are a real challenge. I came up with the title of the book at a period of time when she was 18 that she had stopped talking to us once she became an adult and no longer was sort of within our control. When she found out about the book on social media, somewhat remarkably, the story brought us back together. So her reading the book, she said it was the first time that the book is dedicated to her. She actually wrote the last paragraph of the book. So her reading the book, she said she wept. It was the first time she understood the perspective of my wife and I about raising her.
Oh,
And now
wow.
we're in more regular contact. So that's a pro. It's a kind of a good outcome. The challenge has been that in terms of maintaining stable work, in terms of maintaining healthy weight, and in terms of staying out of trouble with the law, she's had real challenges and committed a felony, which she's pled guilty to, and hopefully the sentencing she'll just get sort of misdemeanor charges. But that relates to the very type of things that we were worried about very early on with her. So I think it's possible that as she gets more mature and more perspective on her behavior, that she can begin to understand it better. But you know, it's been a real challenge for her because of this rooted way of thinking she has, that not trusting the world and being reluctant to follow the rules that we all have to obey to make our way.
I wanted to hit quickly on, you also have a podcast, Things I Didn't Learn in School. Is that the title of it?
It is. So it's available everywhere you get your podcasts. And I put it out because this book for me is a distillation of a huge life lesson I learned, which is about trauma and about the pressure it puts on a family and how to help kids like this. All those lessons were things that just life taught me. It wasn't anything that I learned in school. And my sense is that everybody has those types of stories. And I've actually found by talking with people and putting these episodes up that everybody does. So recent episodes have included the life lessons that somebody learned from watching their country that they live in literally collapse, watching the Soviet Union collapse. Another is about a coach whose father tragically committed suicide when he was very young, and what role sports played in helping psychologically help this person make it through life and how that influences how he coaches today. So I've had a number of those types of people on, and it seems to be really finding an audience.
Great. How long have you been doing the podcast?
I started in this summer, and the book came out in June. So early summer, the book came out, and late June, the podcast came out.
We do have to wrap this up, unfortunately. Do you have a website that you want to give out for the podcast, or a general website for you in the book?
Sure. It's just my last name. So it's Paul Podolsky. I know it's a mouthful. Podolsky, paulpodolsky.com. And there you can get a free chapter sample of the book and see things that people have said about it, and also get free episodes of the podcast. So that's the place to go to for everything.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing this story. Really incredible, enthralling.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's great to get the word out.